Welcome to the House of Jesus. House of Jesus communities are those that are constantly aligning themselves to Jesus, the cornerstone. Accordingly, they preach and teach the words of Jesus, and they walk out his ways. The vision of this video series is to unpack Jesus' culture of godly love and equipping-based empowerment. As we do so, we will detail the biblical foundation for our convictions, as well as provide practical strategies for implementing the Master's ways. But be assured, walking out Jesus' ways is not a decision, but a lifelong calling and process. We are humbled that you are joining us on this quest. The seventh video is entitled The Equipping Value of Coaching and has been recorded in partnership with Drew Stedman, a church planting catalyst. This teaching unpacks the fourth value of Jesus' culture of equipping-based empowerment, namely life-giving coaching. Like his Father, Jesus puts more into his core leaders than he takes out. As we summarize Jesus' ways, listeners will learn that coaching is a value modeled by God. Coaching is grounded in relational trust, and coaching is a learning process catalyzed by evaluative questions. My prayer is that this resource accelerates your alignment to Jesus' ways. For me, a passion for Jesus, I've always had the notion and thought that if I'm passionate for him, then I need to be passionate about following his example. And that really ties directly into today's equipping value of life-giving coaching. Drew, I think this phrase that is my slogan for that value, putting more into servants than we take out, is really a great illustration, literally, of Jesus's example. I have found that personally true in my relationship with him, but even as I read the Gospels, I just see him putting more into people than he takes out. And last time we were talking about your oatmeal apprenticing of your kids, and I think that's exactly the same story with our children. You know, cooking oatmeal is obviously just a means for you and Bethany to invest in your kids and put in more than you take out.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it, because at the end of the day, it's about my kids and their own growth in life. And if some point oatmeal stopped being what they needed, I don't really care so much about that. What I care about is how they mature and grow. It's great when their maturation process coincides with a need in the house, and part of them maturing is learning how to care for the needs of the house. But ultimately, what matters the most is that they become the people that God have called them to be. So I think that's a great way of looking at this, is how are we partnering with Jesus to make disciples and develop people into their calling?
Yeah, and that really is the spirit behind coaching. Obviously, the patient apprenticing provides an onboarding process as servants are getting launched into a new area of ministry. And so this coaching is really a continuation of that same process of investing, encouraging individuals so that they can thrive. And Drew, I think you have shared with me, if I'm remembering correctly, that oatmeal is not where you stop. That might have been the patient apprenticing initially into teaching your kids to cook, but you have continued to use that template and teach them to do other things in the kitchen.
Yeah, I mean, I await the day when I get to come home and my kids have gone out and made some really tasty dinner. So don't tell them my secret evil scheme here. But no, in all seriousness, what I'm hoping for to see happen is that becomes the beginning, but then that sets in motion a whole range of growth and development where they're able to both take care of themselves with increasing levels, but also to serve other people and serve the rest of our family and their family in the future, and just all those different things. So I have a much bigger story in mind than just apprenticing them to cook a recipe.
That's great. Well, again, we see that same type of investment, putting more in than you take out, all throughout the scriptures. I love Jethro's relationship with Moses. He's invested a lot already because Moses worked for him, but he comes alongside him, gives him some great coaching. The Father does that to Jesus. There are many scriptures that highlight this basic concept of putting more in than you take out. Drew, which of these really stands out for you?
Well, I look at the ministry of Paul. There's a few fascinating things that, I mean, even if you look at how he engaged the ministry as Barnabas went to go find him and then really walked with him. And eventually Paul ends up eclipsing in a lot of ways the ministry of Barnabas. But then you look at Paul's ministry. First thing I notice is his missionary journeys have increasingly large numbers of people that go with him that he is developing and
Yeah.
equipping and training. But then we actually have several books in the New Testament that are insight into Paul's ongoing coaching, to use this terminology. And in Timothy's case, Acts gives us some insight into what that apprenticing process looks like. But now you have them ultimately, Timothy becomes a bishop, one of the first bishops that comes after that initial generation of apostles. And what Paul is doing is he is now coaching. He's helping Timothy. Timothy is a major leader in the church of his own right, and he has increasing numbers of responsibility, and eventually will take over a lot of the ministry of Paul when Paul is eventually killed. But those letters give us insight into an ongoing process that Paul was walking through with those that he was mentoring. So with that in background, let's get to this next slide. And, Charlie, I appreciate the drivers here. You have investing, you have assessing, you have expanding. Whenever I see something like that, I normally recognize there's a backstory to it. So why don't you, take us into a little bit of what's behind this?
Yeah, the key thing I would want a lot of people to see when they look at this is that the first step of coaching is the ongoing process of building relationship. And that really is a result not only of my experience as being a ministry servant under other leaders, but of my own work with staff members and laity that I was investing in. And the basic conviction now for me is that unless I trust someone who is investing in me or the people that I'm investing in trust me, that there's really very little capacity that I have to coach them. In other words, they have to grasp and understand and be thoroughly convinced that I have their best interests at heart. And that's really why on the original template of this ministry leadership process, the relational values is the foundation. And I think that's why Paul at the beginning of Ephesians 4 really highlights the priority of humility, patience, gentleness, peacemaking. That relationship really creates the environment in which people can allow us to step into their life, provide assessment, put in more than we take out. So just wanted to remind the listeners to the importance of investment as the initial step of the coaching process. And that's really what this is all about: listening, affirmation, life-giving words and actions. Drew, I know that you have a very clear sense of what it meant for Jesus and actually the other individuals at his baptism, for them to hear this phrase, "This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased." What a powerful affirmation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so, you look at the beginning of Jesus's ministry and it's this giant stamp of approval, from the Father. And what's so cool is we, of course, receive that in Christ as we are in him as well. But I think there's something about being the church is where we need to hear that from one another. And, that's where you see that. Yeah, I mean, even if you want to go reference Paul's letters to Timothy, you see that affirmation of a father speaking over a son. And, it's not always necessarily going to be that clear cut of a more of a near parent child type relationship, but there's still something so powerful that comes from affirmation and knowing that somebody believes in you that then opens you up to receive from that person in a way that's difficult to do otherwise. And, I think a critical component of this, and Charlie, I've been so ministered to by you over the years through this, is prayer, just starting with the process of as I am coaching somebody else, I have to pray for them. And as I pray for them, I actually receive the Father's heart for them. And I remember I was leading years ago, I was leading a life group, and I was a little frustrated with the dynamics of my group. And God challenged me to start praying for the group members by name. And I did that every day for a while. I prayed for them by name, and something shifted in my own heart where I started not to see the thing that frustrated me, but to see who they were in God at a deeper level. And, the frustrating things were still there. And we'll talk about some of that here in a minute. There's still an element of correcting, but something shifted inside of me where my whole mindset changed around how I saw that person.
Yeah, I've had that same experience. But prayer is just one of a variety of ways in which we can invest in people and really communicate and affirm their value. And as I look at this list that I've developed, not every one of these works with individuals. Individuals have preferences. As you look at this list, which of these stand out as the best way to put into you?
Yeah, I'm probably a little bit unique on this one, in the sense of I'm a naturally confident person, which can be good and bad depending on the situation. But I think for me, being included in a decision-making process is a really big deal. And so I would like to think that I'm pretty open if it's something that even I don't agree with, but as long as I was given the chance to talk about it versus hearing about it later, that is always a challenge for me. I always appreciate just short little encouragements. And in fact, in some ways, it doesn't need to be something big, but little encouragement goes a long way. And then somebody coming alongside and identifying and noticing different gifts, and then not just affirming them, but helping me to grow in them. And so creating opportunities for me to exercise them and grow in them. And I've been blessed to have different mentors and bosses and spiritual fathers who've really taken the time to do that. And it's truly meant a lot.
Well, again, this is just highlighting as you uh, want to invest in others, you really have to think about, in a sense, their love language and the ways in which it will be most effective for you to put into them.
Okay, so let's move into this next category of assessing. So we're talking about investment. So we are just as an ongoing lifestyle, finding ways to build relationship, trust, and pouring into people that we are coaching and leading. But now we have to turn the corner. And this is where I think in a lot of ways the rubber hits the road. And I'll just say, this has been a major area of attention and growth and learning, and not always learning the easy way for me. And the reality is not everybody's in the same boat. So, what I have to be able to do is at this stage, it's no longer a cookie cutter approach for somebody. I have to get in there. And in a second here, Charlie will have you share a bit more of what this means. But what I'm having to do is I'm having to meet with somebody and identify. I found both areas of where they have skill and where they're doing really well, and affirm and ensure that I'm helping them to develop in those strengths, but also places where they need further development. And I could have 3 different people with the same job title, and this is going to look different for all 3 of them. And
Right.
in so many ways, this is where probably one of the more challenging aspects of coaching, and maybe even overall with the whole leadership process. So Charlie, take us into this next slide as we think developmentally with people. What do you try to keep an eye on?
Yeah, I agree that it's complex. And obviously, it would be very simple if everyone was either a crawler or a walker or a jogger. But the reality is that when we work with individuals, they have different responsibilities, different contributions they're being asked to make. And in some cases, they're crawlers. In other areas, they're walkers, joggers in a third area. And so we are constantly having to reflect upon, okay, what are the responsibilities the person has? How are they doing in each of these? And then if it wasn't hard enough, you know, when are they ready to move up? Because it's a dynamic process. Just because they're joggers doesn't mean that they are never going to run. So you have to stay nimble and aware and think through what's going on. And so this really kind of then leads to some best practices. And Drew, I'm just going to walk through these quickly. I'd love for you to weigh in on how you are walking some of these out. The first one simply is you have to upfront, even from the very beginning, create a culture of evaluation and feedback. You want people to know that as you lead them, that you're going to want to help them excel and succeed and move forward in their development. And so they should not be surprised when it comes to a conversation that relates to evaluation of their contribution. Secondly, you need to constantly be aware of opportunities that you have to debrief ministry experiences with other people. And debriefing is not so much me telling them what I saw as much as asking them questions, drawing them out. Though the third point is that there are times when timely and specific feedback, either written or verbal, is really valuable. You just have to constantly be aware of what's the best way for them to get it and understand what's going on in their role. Obviously, you want to use periodic self and coaching assessments. That self-assessment is getting them to provide assessment of how they're doing before you explain your perception and provide them with a coaching assessment. So there are really two different conversations going on in that fourth bullet. Finally, I think it's really fair to summarize what the last year has been like, not necessarily related to how much people are compensated, but you're really trying to help them look back, see what went well, what are the places of growth, and that really sets the stage for conversation about the next year. So as you look at that, what have you been learning? What do you see? What do you like?
There's a danger, I think, for anybody involved in pastoral ministry. I see this consistently where you might have somebody who's working with you, whether they're paid or not paid in a position, and we can be content with the job that they're doing in an area. So it's acceptable or even good. And our temptation at that point is to stop giving feedback because we've moved on to something else. And, as a pastor, you have a tremendous amount of responsibility and things in your mind all the time. So, if you've got somebody and they're leading the youth service and the youth service is going well, it's just very easy to not say anything. And so then what ends up happening is you get to a point where there becomes something you need to address. You have not instituted a culture of feedback. And so now all of a sudden it's going to feel like you're coming in with a baseball bat trying to give feedback, and it's going to be intense and emotional, or even if it's not, you might perceive it to be that way because that has not been the culture that you've created as a team. And so what I have learned, and then I try to institute, is create a culture of feedback right out the gate, just like you said, right out the gate, and do it frequently. And because if you're just used to that, so, we've done this before, like on a Sunday morning, we'll have a team that planned the Sunday morning service, and then we'll have a meeting. Normally we have the 24-hour rule, give a little space, but then we're going to give feedback to each other. We're going to talk about the worship, the sermon, all of it. But we do that every single week, and we're going to highlight what's good. And that gives you an opportunity to call out where somebody did a great job at something. But we're also going to give feedback on places of growth and improvement. In the long run, even though doing that might feel uncomfortable, what we're actually doing is creating an opportunity for development. So we don't just have somebody doing a job and they're doing an acceptable version, and so you just don't touch it. And in the reality, if that's what you do, then there's a decent chance that that person's skill level will remain the same for the next 3 years, rather than saying, they do a good job now. And that's great. That's a great point to start on, but I would love to see them grow in their gifting and maturity so that a year from now, that whole ministry and then them as a person exercising the gifts the Lord has given them, we see those operating at a higher level. And that's going to require consistent feedback. The other thing I found has been I want to create a culture of feedback, but then where I need to get more specific, this idea of it being written becomes a big deal. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll have a verbal conversation with the person, and then I'll follow up in an email, and I'll recap what we talked about, and I'll give them an opportunity to edit that. So I'll say, hey, thanks for meeting. Here's what we talked about. Let me know if you saw it, if there's anything you thought I missed, just to make sure that we're on the same page, just so they have a chance not just to hear it from me, but to see it in writing. And then also gives me a record for later if we need to reference that. If there's a misunderstanding 6 months from now where I feel like I articulated my expectations clearly and gave feedback, and a person said it didn't, that gives us both a place of accountability. And honestly, half the time I was the one who was wrong, and I thought I was clear. I go back and read what I wrote, and I realized I wasn't as clear. And, of course, underneath all of this, hopefully what you can see at this point is how all of what we've discussed fits together. Because if you didn't have clear desired outcomes at the beginning, then how do you give feedback? So that's where this becomes a big deal. And ultimately, having desired outcomes stems from clarity. Then you have desired outcomes as we apprentice people and identify people for the right role, and we have to onboard them well. And then ultimately, we're giving them feedback. So all of these different parts start to fit together. And they stem from me being clear with you up front, which then enable me to be clear with you both on where things are going well and not going well. And ultimately, the heart behind that is so that you develop into what God's called you to do.
It's good. I really appreciate the way in which you were connecting the various dots, because if it doesn't go well in assessment, in many respects, we have to look in the mirror and kind of figure out, okay, did I apprentice them well? Do they have a role description that's clear? So there's all kinds of ways in which this process can get derailed, and some of them are ours. This last driver of expanding is really focused on the individuals who are doing really well, and just helping to empower servants to move beyond whatever their role is today, and to really help them step forward into potentially something different or bigger or more challenging. It really depends upon a lot of the dialogue that we've just had in the assessment process. And Drew, I really like the questions that you have and that you use. And I know that you use these some in the coaching, but whenever the time is right, walk us through these questions, because they're really good ones to have in your back pocket when the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, I try to have some, I often do this like as part of a formal review, at least a couple of times a year, where I'm not just reviewing their performance, but I'm also asking these type of questions for their ongoing development. So one of my favorite ones is, where do you see yourself in 3+ years? And I can think of numerous staff people. I remember one person where it was very clear that they were called to lead a church, but they were in a different position at the time, and they were doing good. It wasn't that they were performing poorly in their current role, but there was also a long-term clarity that this was not going to be their best permanent fit. So that brought a tremendous amount of shared understanding between me and this person, because we both knew that this was not a long-term fit. And so as certain things came up, we could identify maybe some points of tension and work through them in a way that I thought was really peaceful. I can think of another scenario where we had somebody that was actually really effective in their job, but they didn't actually see themselves being in that job long term. They were, in their late 20s and had kind of fallen into a position, but it wasn't really something that they had this sense of this is what they wanted to do with the rest of their life. So this question didn't get asked, and it caught a lot of people off guard, because nobody ever took the time to ask this person, is this actually what you want to do? There was just an assumption, because they were so good at it, that that's what they wanted to do. I'll also ask questions like, what's in your heart to accomplish? So the 3-year one's a bit more definitive, but this other one, this is more open-ended. It could be, maybe Charlie, if you were on a team I was leading and you might really appreciate that job, but then there's something that's part of it or something that's tangentially connected. You want to write a book, you want to, there's something that you feel like you just want to grow in. Maybe you're in a pastoral administrative position, but you actually want to grow as a preacher. I like asking things like that. That help me to see just there's a passion inside of you that I just want to know. And then I like looking at, especially in a situation where I'm very clear with somebody that maybe they're in a role, they're doing great in that role, but this is not their long-term role. I'll normally ask them, I'll say, every year we're going to have at least one check-in where I want to know, how are you developing towards that? And where I can, I'd like to even help get behind them to say, let's get you some more education, or let's get you some more skills to help you grow into that. Then lastly, I always want, whether somebody is in a great long-term fit or whether they're in a position that is very clearly not their long-term fit, one of the things I want to keep tabs on is, what new skills are they growing in? And I'll just, a little bit more autobiographically here. I remember several years ago, I was in a job and really enjoyed it. There was nothing wrong with it, but I also sensed, okay, God has called me to some other things as well. And I don't know, I'm not sure how the pieces fit together. And I had this sense that there's some elements of things God had called me to that I wasn't yet walking in. And I find for a lot of people, what we try to do then is say, well, then how do I start to walk in those things? which I really felt challenged by the Lord to say that that's actually not the right way of viewing that. Like if God has called me to something, then I have to trust that God will open that door for me when it's the right time. What I need to be doing is preparing myself. And if I have this sense, so if you have somebody on your team and they feel called that they're supposed to be a lead pastor, um, we have to trust that God will put them into that right role at the right time. And I'm sure you'll be a part of that. But a great follow-up question is, what are the skills a lead pastor needs to have? And rather than just waiting till somebody calls you and says, be my lead pastor, why don't we partner together where I'm a
Right.
part of the development so that you're developing the skill set so that when God does open that door for you, you've stewarded the time before that really well towards growing and developing. And I find that when I think like that, I end up having a much better staff person because they're well equipped for their current role, but then also get to have the joy of seeing them launched out into whatever God has next. Now, Charlie, why don't you walk through some strategies? I'm giving some best practices, but could you maybe put this into, some of the approaches that you've taken?
Yeah, you've really alluded to them. And as you were talking, I really was hearing a put in more than you take out attitude in regards to staff. And they pick up on that, they understand that. It inspires them. And that's part of the building trust process. But practically, these are four strategies that I've experienced and or used in developing individuals. First off, it's just personal growth. It's me taking responsibility, seeing an opportunity, and pulling the trigger. Drew, you're doing that with seminary. I've done that in multiple ways over the years. A second way is addition. It's a mindset for me that I'm going to invest one-on-one in this staff member, this lay leader, and I'm going to raise them up in a specific area. We talk about it and we move forward. Multiplication is kind of an opportunity not only for me to invest in that specific individual, but potentially a team that they're on. And so rather than just investing in one individual, sometimes I invest in others and expand their capacity as they watch me work with them and a group of individuals to form a ministry or accomplish an event. Lastly, a model group, and that's terminology I got a long time ago from a seminary professor, is a setting where you invest in a number of individuals and you're training all of them to do the same thing. I think you could argue that Jesus' group of apostles was essentially a model group. He raised them all up to be able to provide leadership in the kingdom, and then he disbanded them as he left and ascended. I've done this on multiple occasions, like in life group setting, where I would train multiple couples in how to lead, and Mary Lou and I did that, and there was really powerful, especially when some of the individuals that went through our model group process ended up doing model groups themselves. And so over multiple decades, there were a lot of life groups that came out of that strategy. So those are just four common ways that I see where we can be really intentional about developing a process to help someone step into new responsibilities, new challenges.
That's great. So why don't we take all this and let's get a few takeaways that we'd hope you get today. First, coaching is a value that's modeled by God. Earlier, I shared the example of Paul, but ultimately this originates in the ministry of Jesus and how God relates to us. And so we have this story here from Matthew 17 of the Mountain of Transfiguration. But you see this with the disciples. Jesus is consistently pouring into them, showing him what he's doing, pulling them aside, developing them, all of that. That's the very heart of God towards us. And then we see that same thing repeated in the life of the church. And ultimately, that should become an example for us of how we understand our role in ministry, to be the example that we saw with Christ. Second, coaching it's grounded in relational trust. And again, we see this in the example of Jesus, where God the Father speaking over Jesus, and then later Jesus speaking over his disciples. And I think intuitively, maybe we know this, we find that people that we know are for us, people we know that love us, that care for us. It's much easier to receive from those people. Charlie, what's the next takeaway?
Yeah, as we've discussed, coaching is a learning process catalyzed by evaluative questions. And what we mean by that is simply that coaching isn't necessarily giving all the answers and being very prescriptive for the people we're investing in. It is actually catalyzing their learning process. And so we're debriefing them, we're asking them why things happened, we're asking them how they're going to do it next time. Jesus was a master of asking these kinds of questions. And an interesting one here from Matthew 16 that he poses to Peter. So, coaching is simply a process of dialogue that really engages people and helps them to learn from their life experiences rather than us constantly giving pearls of wisdom. So, Drew, as we wrap up on this last slide in regards to life-giving coaching, it's really the same thing that we see all along in each of these values is there's a level of balance that you have to strike. You know, too little coaching undermines their capacity to be successful. Too much coaching likewise creates barriers for them. And I really like the way in which you have captured on multiple of these wrap up slides that you can actually bounce from one to the other. You know, you can start on one error and then you overreact to the other. Would you reinforce that again? Because I need to hear that. I'm sure the listeners need to hear that.
I think I need to hear it. Yeah. But yeah, I think my tendency I see in ministry, which again, every situation's unique, but if I had to point towards one, there's just so much work that needs to be done. And almost every pastor I know has more need than they have people who are there to fill that need. And so when you find somebody, there can be this tendency to throw them into a ministry role and then move over to the next thing that needs development, you know, and I get it. I've been there so many times. It's, you have all these areas, all of them feel important. And you finally have got somebody that is decently competent and you just say, praise God, you're the answer to prayer. You go run and do your thing over there. Now I'm going to go focus on this other need that I haven't been able to get to. So I rarely, hopefully never an intentional thing where we're using somebody or abandoning them. But the scale of the need can be overwhelming to where we just throw people out into roles without really giving them the tools or the feedback they need to be fruitful in those roles. What almost inevitably will happen is because you have not created a culture of feedback and you haven't been investing in that person, at some point, they'll end up doing something that you don't like. And oftentimes it's not just a personal thing, but, you know, I use the illustration of a youth pastor earlier. So you have somebody who they go lead your youth and for 6 months, everything seems great. And, you know, you meet occasionally, and when you meet, they tell you things are going great and you hear a few good testimonies and you don't think about it until 6 months later, you have 4 influential parents in the church come to you expressing all their frustrations with the youth pastor. And now all of a sudden, you know, you have to come in and this can be where you can swing if you're not careful. You start micromanaging all of a sudden because you think, oh, wow, you had this area taken care of. Now I've got to deal with all these parents that are upset and I don't even know what's been going on. So I'm going to dive in there and you start micromanaging. And sometimes in that environment, you kind of have to micromanage to stabilize things. But that's when you find yourself swinging like that, that's a really great sign that a step got skipped and you got to go back and figure out how are you going to reset that relationship in a healthier way and have better expectations for what it's going to look like. And so it's that, almost any time I've seen a scenario where somebody is micromanaging, and I'm trying to think I think this is probably accurate. Almost always they didn't start off micromanaging. They started off just releasing people too quickly into roles. And they started micromanaging later to protect themselves because they kept getting themselves into problems. And so it was a learned behavior because they didn't actually know how to coach somebody in the first place. And learn how to coach, that'll keep you out of the micromanaging ditch as well. So we hope and pray this is helpful. You know, this session, we're really dealing with the ongoing approach of ministry, you know, the ones we've gotten to. Of course, there always is a level of clarity or identifying people with anointed fit and apprenticing. But typically, most of life is going to be spent here with coaching, where you have a team of people that, because of the clarity and the way that you've identified and apprenticed them, they're in a ministry role. You're walking with them, and this ends up, you know, maybe a near synonym could be the managerial relationship or the ministry oversight relationship. And this is what we're describing here. And I think what becomes so important is the potential of this, of not just a perfunctory way to get a job done, but an opportunity to partner with Jesus in the discipleship process of seeing people walk in the fullness of their gifting. And when I look and you take almost any type of institution, but the one that immediately comes to my mind, because I'm a sports fan, I look at football coaches, and you can really trace a lot of the great coaches all originated with one coach who not only did a good job with their team, but really their greatest legacy is the sheer number of other people that they developed and they partnered with. And so you have these coaching trees that are just amazing. And I think if that can occur in sports, how much more in the church, where we can see lineage of incredible people, men and women, released into the ministry, because we didn't just view a management job or whatever the oversight job of checking a box, but we really saw it as an opportunity to disciple, invest, and develop. And I hope and pray that this is an area where we can really excel. So we'll leave you with that today, and look forward to seeing you next time for our next video.